What's up, guys? Welcome to another week of foreign policy. Uh, let's jump right in. So, over the last 2 weeks, we've looked over how the president has come to become more powerful over the years, overall look at the policy decisions from presidents, and main decision points to reference as the rest of the course goes on. Sort of a North Star for all of us to reference. So this week we're going to be going over abilities of the presidency and then limitations of the presidency. So no president, no matter how much they wish they could, can do everything by themselves. So a lot of what we're going over is the line of succession and the cabinet today. So this is the current presidential line of succession as of recording. Um, we're going to go over one fun fact about a bunch of these people soon. But another fun fact we won't have time to go into later is that Secretary of Commerce Howard Lutnick was recently found lying about his relationship with Jeffrey Epstein. So that's fun. Actually, it's horrifying, but still. Now, first in line is, of course, the vice president. There's a whole comedy called Veep. It has its moments. Some people think it's the funniest thing ever. I think it's very okay. The reason I think it's okay, relevant to this, is that essentially the whole joke for these multiple seasons of the TV show is that the vice president, or Veep, is mainly an honorary title and they don't actually do a whole lot in terms of policy making or power. Um, Not exactly true. Of course, if there's a tie in the Senate, the vice president can break that tie. But in terms of like more practical day-to-day stuff, I like to think of a vice president more like a kicker in a football game. What do those have in common is it's like, well, nobody really cares about the kicker until everybody cares about the kicker. Nobody really cares about the vice president until everybody cares, right? Um, and you'd think, oh, well, president's dying or resigning or something like that. That's pretty rare. Not exactly. So the first three presidents to die of illness in office were William Henry Harrison, Zach Taylor, and Warren G. Harding. Harrison got a lot of flack during his campaign for being sickly, and he famously rode his horse around in the rain without a coat and proved everybody right, I guess, by dying of illness soon after. Zach Taylor, who, for one thing, has the name of like a surfer bro, but for another thing, died of, they're not quite sure, but it's something akin to food poisoning. There were rumors about deliberate poisoning, but that's really just rumors that don't have a lot of evidence or credibility. And then Warren G. Harding died of a heart attack. And then, of course, FDR, who was sickly most of his life, died in office during his fourth term, right before the end of World War II. What's wild is like how late he died into World War II. He died April 12th, 1945. Adolf Hitler died about 2 weeks later on April 30th. And with presidential assassinations, there's always two we think about and two we don't think about. Of course, the two everyone references first are Abraham Lincoln and JFK. Both of them shot in the head. There's all the weird coincidences that really aren't the scope or subject of this class to get into. And then you have McKinley on the left here, who was shot in 1901 by an anarchist, and Garfield on the right, who was shot by a severely mentally ill man named Charles Guiteau. I'm told there's a Netflix series or something about the Garfield assassination now. I haven't seen it. I saw it has Michael Shannon, who is normally really good. Uh, yeah, here's the picture of the Garfield assassination and Charles Guiteau. Um, Famously, Garfield, while shot on a Saturday, It took him about 80 days to die, and then he ended up dying on a Monday. So um, I believe that's where the Garfield jokes comes from. I'm joking, of course. It's pretty macabre, but it is a weird coincidence still. And among presidents, there's been one resignation, Richard Nixon, after what we all know, the Watergate scandal. For those who don't know, he was caught covering up wiretapping by this organization called the Committee to Re-elect the President, or abbreviated to CREEP, Committee to Re-elect the President. Yeah, but they were caught tapping the Watergate Hotel. Some family history about this one, though, is that my great uncle Curtis was actually a member of the Committee to Re-elect the President. And before Watergate broke out, he was injured falling off a telephone pole in DC. What he was doing on that telephone pole, no one's quite sure. He took it to his grave. He worked in the White House at the time. So it's widely believed, at least within my family, that there was more going on with Watergate and the tapping and all that. But it wasn't so much the scandal, it was him covering up the scandal in the first place. So, yeah, a little fun Paul lore, as some of my students call it sometimes. But yeah, Nixon resigned and was replaced by someone who was not his VP. This is his VP, Spiro Agnew, who was also caught up in all the corruption and everything. So he actually resigned before Nixon resigned. So Spiro Agnew was never president, which a lot of the Greek community found to be a big tragedy because Spiro Agnew, as you can probably tell by his name, was a big leader in the Greek American community. And that leads to this weird case of Gerald Ford. Now, what made his presidency so famous, odd, we might say, is that it was preceded by the Watergate scandal. VP Agnew resigns, then Nixon resigns, leading the Speaker of the House, Gerald Ford, to become president. This is the only time someone who is not elected to the presidential ticket has ever become president. And Ford famously pardoned Nixon, which tanked his credibility, tanked his popularity with a lot of the country, and he wasn't able to get that much done. It's hard for me to report on a lot of this objectively. Like I said, my family has that history with Nixon. And then probably the only fan I've ever heard of Gerald Ford would be my dad. And it wasn't because of anything Ford ever did when he was president. Because Gerald Ford, when he was in college, was a really good football player. So my dad always liked that. He had actually he had been offered contracts by the Lions and the Packers, but turned them down so he could go to law school at Yale and eventually get into politics. So 2 points with this. One being that people only really like Ford for very niche reasons, and two, but it also means that my whole presidential succession kind of being like football kickers metaphor has come full circle, even though Gerald Ford played a center and linebacker. But we won't go into those details. So overall, that means 4 presidents have died from illness, 4 have died from assassinations, and 1 resigned. Now, 4 plus 4 plus 1 equals 9, so that means 9 presidents didn't finish their terms. And another thing I hear people get wrong a lot is we'll refer to President Trump as the 47th president of the United States. When he was first elected, people who didn't like him would call him 45, because at the time he was the 45th president of the United States. And that's where that counting convention really doesn't work super well, because President Trump and President Grover Cleveland um, were both non-consecutive presidents. So while Trump is the 47th president of the United States, there have actually only been 45, as you subtract one for Trump and one for Cleveland, meaning that out of 9 presidents who didn't finish their terms, that's 9 out of 45, meaning 20%. So putting that in other terms, the VP matters a hell of a lot about 20% of the time. As you probably know, the current vice president is J.D. Vance from Ohio. For those who don't know, he veteran Harvard law grad, I believe, wrote a best-selling book. I worked at Barnes & Noble when the book came out, and we sold so many copies of that. This is before he got into politics, of course. Eventually runs for senator of Ohio, wins, and is bumped up to be president. Shortly after Donald Trump's the assassination attempt on Donald Trump. And there's a reason for that timing. If you're curious as to what that was or what the common theory I've heard is, you let me know and we can talk about it later. But yeah, currently J.D. Vance. So, like I said earlier, the president can't do everything. No matter how much a president would like to, they have to delegate stuff to different people. For the foreign policy, well, for most things, it's just the cabinet. So people from different sects of the United States government all meet under the presidential cabinet and follow the president's policies on that. The ones I have underlined in red here are the ones that have, I'd say, even remotely like some influence in foreign policy. Department of Agriculture might not seem like the most foreign policy heavy one, but it actually does have some say in foreign policy. Whereas the Interior, Education, Labor, Veterans Affairs, Housing, Urban Development, Health and Human Services are important, but not that important in U.S. foreign policy, in our analysis of U.S. foreign policy. Other cabinet spots listed there are more of the observation, intelligence, however you want to say. So there's the CIA with John Ratcliffe, Department of Homeland Security with Kirsty Noem, and then Director of National Intelligence led by Tulsi Gabbard. So as you can probably guess, the Department of Agriculture assists in food aid, agricultural trade, setting import goals. Not a lot of, for example, sugar or coffee are going to be grown in the United States. So they set ideas for how many we need to import and stuff like that. Argues for sanctions exemptions occasionally, especially with the tariffs under the Trump administration. This has been a big deal. There's also the Department of Defense or War, and this is what a lot of the enforcement for what U.S. foreign policy looks like. It's run by Pete Hegseth, who was a veteran, then I believe Harvard Law School. But it's overlooking Department of the Army, Navy, Air Force. Beneath the Navy is the Marine Corps, but you also have the Space Force. Coast Guard washes between Department of War. I'm going to take that pause every time because I'm not used to saying it. Sometimes it's Department of War, sometimes it's Department of Homeland Security. We can get into why later. But in terms of like figuratively and literally impactful, the Department of War is a big part of U.S. foreign policy. Another big one for U.S. foreign policy I think probably the most understated actually in U.S. foreign policy is the Department of Energy. That's overseen by Chris Wright. And so when we think Department of Energy, I think we think um, maybe just one or two things. And by one or two things, I would say either energy production or export versus energy consumption or import. And so we look at this is the LNG exports from the US or from North America. Um, but there is, like, I would say it's almost at par with the Department of Defense because of one thing that the Department of Energy oversees that the Department of Defense only assists in, and that is atomic weapons or nuclear weapons are actually under the purview of the Department of Energy. Now, as you can see in this picture on the right, Air Force, Navy, the like will produce rockets for it or missiles for it, but when we talk about who controls the warheads, their production, storage, and all that, it's under the direct purview of the Department of Energy. And then for another big foreign policy department is the Department of Justice, which is again like what does that have to do with foreign policy? Because it's supposed to be looking within, right? So the CIA is the intelligence agency that looks without or looks at other countries, and then the FBI, which is under the Department of Justice, looks within. We'll get into that. Leader of the Department of Justice is Attorney General Pam Bondi on the left, and then the director of the FBI is Kash Patel on the right. So for the Department of Justice, or DOJ for short, um, in their foreign policy, we have international law enforcement, so a lot of sanctions, especially counterintelligence, or what we think of as spy hunting. So there's intelligence or spying, and counterintelligence is spy hunting. I would think counterintelligence meant being the opposite of intelligent, so being stupid. But that was just me being counterintelligent. But dumb. Anyway, fun fact: a UT professor was falsely accused in 2011, acquitted in 2020, of stealing scientific secrets for China. And then there's also extradition treaties. So if you commit a crime in one country, you can be extradited to another country. Or just because you've escaped the country that you committed the crime in, depending on the relationship between the country you ran away to, you can be shipped back for trial. One of the more famous cases of almost extradition was the director Roman Polanski. I think he's recently cropped up in media again, and people kind of remember his name again for his wife, pictured here, Sharon Tate. Polanski was out of town at the time, but she and several others were murdered by the Manson family. And there's that Tarantino movie that came out recently, Once Upon a Time in Hollywood, where Margot Robbie plays Sharon Tate. So think of it as like Sharon Tate's husband, I guess. He was a famous director, sort of seen as like up and coming. I say was as if he's dead. He's still alive, but up and coming 70s, this very experimental time in film. But he has two especially big hits. One being Chinatown with Jack Nicholson, and then the other one being Rosemary's Baby with Mia Farrow. So Bound pushing cinema. He's this up and coming guy. In 1969, his wife is murdered, along with others, in one of the most high profile murders of all time. And he's got all the sympathy. I believe 74, he is just destroys that sympathy entirely by I'm not sure if I can say he did it for sure because it's not proven guilty and all that, but alleged to have slept with a 13-year-old girl. Cover myself legally. Now, to avoid proceedings, he did plead. No, yeah, he did plead guilty to it in '77. He got a lesser charge, and then the judge said, "This isn't nearly enough. You're going to have to serve more time. Come back to court." He didn't want to go back to court, so he ended up running away to France because for crimes like this, there's no extradition to the United States. So from the late 70s until 2009, he's living in France. Now, 2009, he's invited to Switzerland. So he's an old man now, invited to Switzerland to receive an award for some other work that he's done. And he figures it's okay. So he goes to Switzerland. The thing is that Switzerland does have an extradition treaty with the United States. So he's arrested in Switzerland. There's about 9 months of legal battles. And eventually, I'm sorry to report that there's no happy ending to this story. He's released and sent back to France. I don't know who was pushing for, he pled guilty in '77 to this unspeakable act with a 13-year-old girl. But yeah, no real happy ending to this. He's still free, walking around in France now. He's had multiple other women come forward and accuse him of unspeakable things. You can probably guess what. But that's at least an attempt of an extradition. It gives you an idea of what extradition is and can be. Generally, well, not generally, I would say I've heard of people being flagged in like FBI databases and stuff just for Googling what countries do not have an extradition treaty with the United States. So I'm not about to Google that. I don't recommend you Google it or Bing it or Yahoo it. But yeah, just interesting story to keep in mind. And yeah, 2009, weird year for perverts and celebrities and all that because it's also the year Epstein pled guilty. Now, something that's not at all related to Hollywood crimes and extradition is the Department of Transportation. Not related at all, except for one very cool thing, and that is U.S. foreign policy. That's correct. So, Department of Transportation doesn't have a ton other than maritime law. So you can see here, like all the different zones within maritime law and what you can and can't do. And then aviation agreements, probably the more difficult to coordinate, especially for the United States, because of one particular reason about the US that we have causing issues that other states don't have. And that quirky thing about the United States is the imperial system. Um, so as you can see with this map, it's basically only one uses the imperial system the way we do. And yeah, people love giving America crap about it. Sometimes I agree. I will say it's not the worst system. The worst is the UK, where they have this weird mix of they'll use pounds but then Celsius, and it's a mess. I love the UK. I've got family in UK. My brother-in-law is going to Oxford right now, but they got to pick a lane. Um, anyway, this hasn't led to any major disasters that I can think of off the top of my head. Sort of the biggest would be the Gimme glider. This was 1983. There was some confusion over how much fuel was being put into this plane. And so it was not enough because it was confusing pounds with kilograms. And then what ends up happening is it runs out of fuel and has to make glides into safety. So it's the Gimme glider. But no deaths, no, I think only like minor injuries, if any at all. And so the Department of Transportation assists in international flights, making sure the airspace is clear and stuff like that. What is probably the most consequential, aside from the Department of Defense, because it's the literal military, is the Department of State. And that's being headed by Secretary of State Marco Rubio. Now, what the Department of State is doing is overlooking basically everything diplomatic. So that can be embassies. The United States has embassies, by definition, all over the world. Sometimes it's led to disaster, like the Iranian Revolution. They also overlook issuing of passports. I believe if you get a passport now, it'll have Marco Rubio's, well, a copy of his signature in it. There's also the travel advisory system. So before you go anywhere, you should check to see if it's considered a safe or unsafe place to travel. This is the most recent one I could find, and I had no idea Europe was so tan. Um, what's very funny is, of course, I think I mentioned my brother-in-law studying in Oxford, so it's got that tan or like use caution. And my wife is worried about me going to Mongolia in a few months, and that's considered to be super, super safe, right up there with Canada. Um, yeah, I think it's just a long way of saying I'm super stoked about Mongolia. Anyway, then there's also the diplomatic meetings. I'd say probably the most famous recent ones would be the Trump-Kim summit during the first Trump administration. Um, just because it was so odd or so unique to have any level of peace talks with North Korea. And then you have the defense attaché system, where essentially that the Department of State will both send attachés to other departments and have attachés join them on different projects. So it's not any one thing, but it's fingers in all these different pies. They're always involved in other departments in order to assist or get assistance from them. And then recently, I would say most controversially, would be USAID or USAID. We'll get into that in a second. So USAID, or United States Agency for International Development, or USAID, um, does exactly what it says, sends development to developing countries. That can be food, investments. Back in the day, microloans were a big thing. And sometimes it'll work through locals, it'll work directly with the governments, depending on what the situation calls for. Or I should be using the past tense for a lot of this, because in the second Trump administration, a lot of this funding was cut. This was controversial for several reasons. One being that accusations of waste, fraud, and abuse. So, gender-based violence in Pakistan, a scoping study. This is one of the more tame, and I think most academics would agree that this is a perfectly acceptable use of taxpayer dollars. But what the accusation was is that, well, there's twofold. One, under the Biden administration, the accusation was that it was promoting, and please forgive me for using this word, I can't stand this word, quote unquote woke ideology. When I say woke, to go off on a bit of a tangent, it's a bad word. Not that it's offensive or rude or anything, but it's a bad word in the sense that nobody can define what it means. So it's literally bad at being a word. So we'll say promoting socially progressive ideology. And so there were accusations of like transgender comic books, transgender operas, stuff like that. A lot of that has been debunked. It's just an excuse to cut government spending. But yeah, so with the new Trump administration, or Trump 2, a lot of USAID has been gutted. And what that means for the developing world is less access to opportunity, so no development. But the accusation that carries a bit more weight to more people isn't that it was funding woke or socially progressive ideologies in other countries. It was that it was a thinly disguised front for CIA funding or corruption, or different ways to move money around in other countries that the taxpayer really couldn't follow around that well. So we would hear accusations of X amount of millions or billions spent on something in another country. You go there, you find out that that's not been an appropriate use of, or that's not even what the money has been spent on, and it's all going to corrupt officials. Um, I think that's why Pakistan stood out so much, is because Pakistan is famous for having like major problems with corruption. So that's how that one stuck a bit more in people's memories, even though, like I said, a lot of these accusations were debunked. This is a powerful position that's under the direct purview of the president. So you would think keeping someone super loyal, not necessarily the case all the time. A lot of the times, the Secretary of State is a case of keep your friends close, but your enemies closer. Mario Puzo, author of The Godfather, I wrote that. I tried to find a good image, but it was like literally all just like hype beast edits of Al Pacino or Marlon Brando in The Godfather. I didn't want to do that, so here's just a beach. Um, Point being, aside from that weird tangent, is that Secretary of State is a way to keep internal rivals in line also. Now, we talked about the 2016 GOP or Republican primary in the last class, and we'd mentioned that Trump won it a lot easier than Hillary won hers for being such a firebrand. That's why people love him and dislike him. But the two other big contenders at the time were Ted Cruz and Marco Rubio. Ted Cruz from Texas, Rubio from Florida. Um, I forgot what Trump's nickname for Ted was at the time, but Rubio's nickname was Little Marco, which I don't know the origin with that. Point being, Rubio was seen as a rival to Trump. He wasn't given Secretary of State in the first administration. Trump's first, he went through a lot of them in the first administration. Rex Tillerson was the first one, so former Exxon CEO, also my dad's former boss. Um, but then, yeah, went through quite a few of them. With Rubio lasting as long as he has in the second Trump administration, it's notable for sure. And you saw the same thing with Obama in 2008. His main rival being Hillary Clinton. She was eventually made to be Secretary of State. So, like with Rubio, it's a twofold purpose. One, it's a way for Obama to keep Hillary in line. Two, it's a way to develop her foreign policy experience for what would eventually be the 2016 run. So on the right, you see the famous Bin Laden raid photo. So that's the Situation Room in the White House. You have Obama, Biden, and Hillary, and all these different people watching the raid on the Bin Laden compound. So they're definitely more impactful than vice president, which is part of the reason why Biden didn't run in 2016. Hillary did. Also, Biden was going through a family crisis with his son. But so, point being, pay attention to who Secretary of State was and who Secretary of State is, because that tells you a lot about the president. And you know I had to do it to you. 2008 was mentioned, so I'm dropping this slide. It is important to get the idea, or to not get the idea that the president has 100% control over who gets appointed to the cabinet. Many of the positions, they have to go through Congress and get congressional approval. Normally, this isn't an issue because the president picks his cabinet after winning an election, which means he likely has control of Congress. That being said, there are some exceptions where a nominee for cabinet just doesn't have the votes, doesn't have the support, and has to back down. So we'll go over two, one on the left and one on the right. So the one from 2020 and 2021, so late 2020, early 2021, was Neera Tanden. So she's a Biden appointee or nominee or first choice for the Office of Management and Budget, so help setting the budget. And Tandon had had a long career, heavy Democrat for Clinton, Hillary Clinton especially. Um, and so there was no real disagreement over her ability to do the job. A lot of people on the left actually didn't like her because the further left you go, the more pro-union you get. And Tandon had a very long anti-union history. But that's not what sunk her. What actually sunk her is, believe it or not, wild posts on social media, punching left a lot of the time over cultural stuff. So when Joe Manchin announced, Democrat senator who's likes to play the middle more, when he announced he would not support her cabinet spot, she withdrew her, basically asked to be withdrawn from consideration. What was very similar to her story was a few years ago with Matt Gaetz out of Florida. He was the first choice for, or rumored to be first choice for some high level position that would need Congress, I keep saying Congress, but it's Senate, approval for cabinet. But like Tandon, he carried too much baggage. First thing was an ethics committee complaint. There were rumors about him and women of ill repute, I guess is the most sanitized way I can say it. There's also some corruption concerns, and he's very polarizing, like Tandon, except to the right. And so just carrying too much baggage, he wasn't ever formally nominated, but it was still seen as an upset or a loss to the Trump administration, that he wasn't ever given any Senate-approved positions. So that's what a lot of the cabinet does on paper. We're going to take the last few slides to talk about practice. But overall, this is what the line of succession in a lot of the cabinet looks like. Just in case people didn't catch it, this is the guy that was on the Epstein list and was caught lying about it. This guy right here. So just in case you forgot, it was Howard Lutnick. Secretary of State can also be a diplomatic tool in other ways that aren't really written on paper. One starts with Vladimir Putin making a big announcement. He's back on his bullshit. This is before his invasion of Ukraine, before his invasion of Crimea. It was his invasion of Georgia. And yeah, let's just get this out of the way now. His invasion of Georgia was in 2008. Before the election, though. This was in August. And of course, the headline saying Russia just invaded Georgia confused a lot of people because they thought, well, why wouldn't they invade like New York or Los Angeles? Why would they invade Georgia? Like, you mean the state Georgia? And then policy nerds would be like, yeah, the state, which in their mind means country. And so once people kind of figured out what was going on, they were like, oh, okay, so they invaded the country Georgia, and then it kicked off. Memes weren't really big back then, but it kicked off something like that with this joke about Stalin, who was actually not from Russia, he was from Georgia. So a joke that was bouncing around the internet was that Stalin was a good old boy or a redneck because he was from quote unquote Georgia. It was a lot funnier at the time. Quick fun fact, Stalin was not from Russia or the USSR. Napoleon was not from France, he was from Corsica. And Hitler was not from Germany, he was from Austria. I don't know what phenomenon that is, but there you go. But anyway, so Russia invades Georgia, 2008. I'm not going to show the screen again. And it's, of course, seen as this big offense on international order to be invading your neighbors like that. And it's really bad because people don't like that anytime Russia has access to the ocean, because that's more opportunities for a strong navy. And there's this old like Russian and slash Soviet dream of a blue water navy, this idea that they're going to have this big naval presence. And so they keep going to try to make what's called a warm water harbor. So this is where the Secretary of State comes in. At the time, it's Condoleezza Rice, who is the first black female Secretary of State, the second female Secretary of State after Madeleine Albright, and the second black Secretary of State after Colin Powell. So what they decided to do, I believe it was either Bush or someone in his war room, said what we're going to do is we're going to put this high-level diplomat on an aircraft carrier, which ended up being not an aircraft carrier, but there's an aircraft carrier with her, and send her into the Baltic Sea right next to Georgia. What's the point of this is, well, you don't want to get into a shooting war with a nuclear power, like Russia, for obvious reasons. So what they decide to do is this, because it's essentially a take the first shot punk, or a way to flex without touching. So they've got Condoleezza Rice on an aircraft carrier, psyching them out, saying like, take the first shot, give us a reason to unleash these 90,000 tons of diplomacy, or in short form, just stand there menacingly. So a high-level diplomat you can have to establish a strong presence overseas, and it worked. The war didn't last very long. I believe just over like 2 weeks. No major gains in Russia's territory. So, point being, Secretary of State is important and can do a lot. While we're continuing on this sort of less formal paths for what the cabinet can do, I wanted to talk about sort of a court intrigue. I couldn't find a good picture for court intrigue, so I just Googled court intrigue and then found this soap opera about Chinese imperial concubines, it looks like. But same premise is all these different people vying for power from the, not emperor, but in their world, basically the emperor, like this much authority over their careers. And we can talk about all the sucking up and stuff, but that's not as fun as the falls. So, as per usual, we're going to go over one left wing and one right wing. So one Biden and one Trump. Sort of the biggest Biden fall out of the court intrigue was Kamala Harris. It's pretty extensively documented that Biden and Harris did not like each other very much, which is fine. Not all presidents have to get along. There's been rumors that Biden and Obama didn't get along very well, and stuff like that. But, well, of course, Trump and Pence famously, if you know what happened on January 6th, that's probably the best example. Anyway, Kamala Harris, famous for having sort of a word salad approach to interviews. And during this interview with Lester Holt, she kept saying, we've been to the border. And then Holt was saying, but you haven't. And then she kept not answering the question and laughing. It didn't go well, being the point. So she was, you can say it's fair or not, but objective is that she did not give many interviews after that for a very long time, because a lot of the Biden administration thought she was hurting more than helping. Now, if you're a Kamala fan, don't take that personal. You could also say that Biden was setting her up for failure. You could say a lot of things, but she essentially fell out of favor, not assigning blame anywhere. And she gave so few interviews during the rest of the administration that it was even a problem picked up by the New York Times. And if you are a Kamala fan, it kind of is her being set up for failure because she wasn't as sharp as she could have been, you might say, for when the Biden dropped out and her campaign took over. This other case of court intrigue also ran for president in 2020, and also a woman of Indian descent, which when I planned this out, I didn't think of that, but here we are. Tulsi Gabbard. She made a name for herself on the podcast circuit and in the 2020 election by being an explicitly anti-war candidate, which to a lot of people spoke out because she's, I believe, one of the only people running at the time who was a veteran. I think during the debates, she was the only veteran on stage. I'm happy to be fact check on that though. But either she, for different reasons, she feels like her career with the Democrats has come to an end. You can take it one of two ways. Either she felt like she was unfairly treated by the party, which is what she would say, or you could think of it as like she's going to be more successful by changing sides. So whatever happens, Tulsi becomes a Republican and ends up as the director of national intelligence for Trump. Thing is she's made her entire brand being anti-war. So Trump bombs Iran, which is the cardinal sin in the anti-war movement, and it's believed that there was some conflict in the office between them. Because like I said, she's trying to protect her brand. During the campaign, Trump ran on an anti-war platform. So by bombing Iran, he was going back on that. But what ends up happening is she gets iced out of the administration after the Iran bombing, likely because of this. And lately, she's been investigating voter fraud in Georgia. Not in 2008, though, in 2025 and 2026. But seeing how she's sort of out of his or Trump's graces and is trying to earn her way back in. Okay, more court intrigue. So court intrigue being how different people navigate this. Like I said, couldn't find a picture, so I took another one from a Chinese drama. This one I've actually seen. It's quite good. The same director did the 2008 Olympics opening ceremony. I recommend it. They spill lots of tea because it's Imperial China. So aside from fighting within the White House or people falling out of favor and sort of being sent to the wild to do stuff to earn back the good graces of the person running the White House, there's also a way to build up alliances or build up mutual interest to make sure that they all go through. So one thing that jumps out is, of course, these 5 people. First, they all have something in common, other than being Republicans, which of course would be the case in a Republican White House. But I trust you guys are smart enough to figure out the pattern as soon as it starts. So first being Attorney General Pam Bondi, who before being Attorney General for the federal government was Attorney General for the state of Florida. Second, Marco Rubio, before being Secretary of State, he was a senator from Florida. Middle, White House Chief of Staff, so runs Trump's day-to-day operations. She doesn't have to be appointed. Her name's Susie Wiles. Before she was Chief of Staff, her biggest government job was Chief of Staff for the mayor of Jacksonville, Florida. You have Mike Waltz, National Security Advisor, who was, you guessed it, a congressman from Florida. Last one, obviously head of state, Donald J. Trump, who before he was president and in between his presidencies was a resident of Florida. So why does this matter? Also saw somewhere a third of ambassador picks are from Florida, which I don't know to be true, but it's something I saw bouncing around. So why Florida? Well, first off, it used to be a purple state and is slowly turning red. And so it's a way to consolidate Republican influence there. There used to be a saying, presidential elections begin in Iowa and end in Florida. Now that Republicans sort of control Florida much more, it's consolidating power. What does this have to do with policy, though, is that Trump will likely leave politics when he's done being president. If he follows the Constitution, that'll be in 2028 or 2029. But they still want to build up influence in Florida, and that means courting the Florida voters. Now, one thing you might know about Florida is that they have a ton of Cuban migrants, Cuban and Venezuelan, escaping the Marxist regimes in both Cuba and Venezuela after the election or after the revolutions. Well, an election in Venezuela, but a lot of the refugees, especially, hold on to hope that eventually they will return to Cuba and liberate it. So it's what we saw with like the Bay of Pigs invasion, which didn't end up panning out well. A lot of them refuse to learn English, not because they dislike America, but because they feel like they're going to move back to Cuba any day now, so there's no point in learning English. So, point being is that a very big population of people who detest any type of Marxism in Latin America. Can you maybe see where I'm going with this in terms of recent event? Cuban refugees continue to go into Florida too, by the way, and even if they can't vote, their children can if they're born there, and it turns the state, especially the south of the state, where a lot of those people are from, even more red. And so what influence they want a lot of the time is liberation from communists, from Marxists, to use a more appropriate term, in all of Latin America. Where the president is from and who he surrounds himself with does have an effect on foreign policy, right? We can see it with the special attention the current Trump administration has to socialists, Marxists, however you want to say it, in Latin America. If you were in my 102 class or my 265 class, you better damn well know that they're Marxists. I'm going to be very upset with you. Anyway, point being, these things do matter, and who you surround yourself with does matter. I told myself this would be a shorter video. I apologize. To review, we went over the cabinet, what they do on paper, what they do off paper. The next class is limitations to the presidency. We get to talk about the big branch of government that we've sort of been ignoring this whole time. I think I've mentioned it once. Drum roll, please. Okay, don't actually drum roll because I can't hear you. The Supreme Court. So I'll look forward to talking to you guys Thursday. As I record this, it's Tuesday afternoon. Hope to see y'all at the Thomas Paine event for extra credit. I'll put out an announcement soon. Anyway, see ya.